If you're thinking of moving to Brazil, I've got 3 words for you. Don't do it. And I've probably already got some Brazilians typing in the comment section going, how dare you speak badly about Brazil? But relax, I'm not saying Brazil is a bad country. And those of you who have watched my other videos know that I've done many saying that I think Brazil is great. And for me, moving to Brazil was the best decision that I've ever made. But that doesn't mean it's the right country to move to for everyone. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the challenges and the negatives of living here. And if you're someone that places a lot of importance on these things, then maybe Brazil isn't the right country for you. So let's have a look. Okay, so the first challenge or difficulty of moving to Brazil is the language barrier.
Do you speak English?
No.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, it's very simple. If you want to move to Brazil, you need to be able to speak Portuguese. Because only a small proportion of the population, around 5%, can actually speak English to a decent level. So if you want to talk to people day to day, in stores, Uber drivers, and also if you want to make friendships and get a job, you have to speak Portuguese. I mean, there are certain areas in Brazil where you find more people who can speak English, so like the touristy areas of Rio de Janeiro, and also the central business district in Sao Paulo. But away from those areas, you're going to struggle just speaking English. Now, if you can speak Spanish, on the other hand, that will get you a bit further, because there are many similarities between Spanish and Portuguese. But saying that, I've seen many Argentinians in Brazil trying to speak Spanish with Brazilians, and sometimes it works, but a lot of the time it becomes very confusing for both parties. But you don't have to be fluent in Portuguese, you just need to be able to understand and communicate to a decent level. So when I decided to move to Brazil, I took Portuguese lessons for about 2 years before I moved. And so my Portuguese was kind of between basic and intermediate. But then when I arrived in Brazil, I was forced to speak every day, and within 6 months, my Portuguese had improved a lot, and I could understand the majority of things that people were saying, and I could also speak to them pretty well. Obviously, still making lots of grammatical and pronunciation mistakes, but it was good enough to get by. So if you're someone who struggles to learn a new language, and also if you hate not being able to communicate with people properly, and you're going to have some awkward and embarrassing moments where Brazilians are going to stare at you, maybe laugh at you because you said something completely stupid. So if you're someone like that who doesn't want to go through these things, then maybe Brazil isn't right for you. Then it might be better to choose another country like Thailand or the Philippines, where you can get by speaking English, or maybe Portugal or Spain, where you have some big English expat communities where you can live and just speak English. Okay, and another challenge of living in Brazil are the salaries. So if you're someone thinking of moving to Brazil and getting a job here, then you might get shocked by the salaries. So salaries in Brazil are significantly lower than they are in Europe and the US. So if you look at average salaries, so this is from Numbeo, and so the average salary in Brazil is $519 per month. And if you compare that to the US, which is $4,300 per month, and in Sweden it's $3,200 per month. So the salaries are 6 to 8 times higher in the US and Sweden compared to Brazil. And if we look at a couple of specific jobs as well, just to see a difference there. So if we look at an accountant, for example, so the annual average salary for an accountant in Brazil is about 64,000 reais, which is $12,400. And then if you compare that to the US, it's $67,000. So 67 versus 12. If we're a teacher, the average salary in Brazil is 39,000 reais, which is $7,500 per year. And in the US, it's about $42,000. So 42,000 versus 7,000. And if you work in retail, so a retail assistant, the average salary in Brazil is 29,000 reais per year, which is about $6,000. And in the US, it's $37,000. So you can see salaries are significantly lower in Brazil compared to the US and Europe. Now, some of you are probably thinking, but the cost of living in Brazil is probably lower as well. And you're right, many things are cheaper. So the cost of property to buy or to rent, groceries, eating out, healthcare, and also services like maids, gardeners, and tradesmen, they are all cheaper in Brazil. But then there are other things which are more expensive, so like electronics and clothes and other consumables. They can be more expensive in Brazil. So the end result is that the cost of living is definitely lower in Brazil, but it's not like 6 to 8 times lower compared to the US and Europe. So what that means is that overall, if you're working in Brazil, getting an average salary in Brazil, you're going to be worse off financially. So I always recommend to people that if you're planning to move to Brazil, try and earn an income in dollars, euros, sterling, because that's going to make your life a lot easier. So maybe that's offering some consulting or some freelance online, some social media, investing, or if you have a property in the US or Europe, renting that out, and so you're receiving rent in dollars or euros, then that's going to help you a lot. So if you're someone that's planning to move to Brazil and getting a job, then just be aware that salaries in general are lower here, and so make sure that's not a deal breaker for you. Okay, and another challenge of living in Brazil are the taxes. So when you talk to Brazilians in general, they complain that taxes are very high in Brazil, which is true for some taxes, but not all of them. So if you look at income tax, for example, the top rate is 27.5%, which is lower than many countries. So in the US, for example, the federal tax rate is 37%. But then you've got state taxes as well, so it can get to over 50%. And in Sweden as well, the top rate of tax is over 50%. So if you just look at the top rate of income tax, then it's actually lower in Brazil. But then if you look at when you start paying the top rate of tax, or the tax thresholds, then you'll see that you start paying the top rate of tax in Brazil a lot quicker. So the top rate of tax is applied to a much lower income in Brazil compared to the US and Sweden. So what that means is that if you're earning a relatively low salary, then you'll actually end up paying a higher amount of tax in Brazil compared to the US and Sweden. But if you have a high salary, so we're talking like $200,000-$300,000, then it's the opposite, and then you'll end up paying less tax in Brazil. Obviously, you have some very low tax countries like Bermuda, Cayman Islands, and yeah, if you compare income tax against those countries, then yeah, Brazil is much higher. But in general, when Brazilians are talking about tax being very high in Brazil, they're talking about the sales tax, or the VAT, on products and services. So these taxes can be very high, especially on imported products. So sales tax in Brazil is pretty complicated. They have various taxes. One's called ICMS, one's called IPI, ISS, PIS, COFINS. So you've got various taxes that apply to products and services, and the end result is that the taxes can be very high. So if you just look at a couple of examples, so if you look at a mobile phone, a cell phone, then the overall sales tax is about 62%. And then if you look at cars, the sales tax is about 40% if the car is manufactured or assembled in Brazil, but if it's imported, it can be over 100%. Now, Brazil is currently reforming sales tax, and so they're trying to reduce down the number of taxes and make it a bit simpler. But even with these reforms, the total sales tax is still going to be pretty high. So the estimate is that the average sales tax in Brazil after these reforms is still going to be around 28%, which is one of the highest in the world. So I mean, in Sweden it's 25%, and in the US it's between 0 and 9%. It all depends on the local and state taxes. So if you're someone who currently lives in a country where taxes are relatively low, and you're planning to move to Brazil, then you might get a shock. And so yeah, the tax implications is something you definitely need to consider before you decide to move to Brazil. Okay, and another challenge of moving and living in Brazil is the bureaucracy. And so in Brazil, many things, especially involving the government, can be a bit difficult and a bit slow to do. So I'm talking about getting your ID card, getting your tax number, your driving license. But also some things in the private sector as well can be difficult. So like opening up a bank account, selling and buying a house. All of these things can be a bit slow and involve quite a lot of paperwork. And for me, one of the most frustrating things when I arrived here in Brazil was the fact that I had to go to a notary office constantly to get documents like birth certificates, marriage certificates notarized. And also when you're entering into some sort of agreement, be that buying, selling a house or something else, then your signature needs to be certified as well at a notary office. So for me, that was quite a big shock, and I just felt it was a waste of time and money that you have to constantly go there, because in Sweden you don't really need to do that. But saying that, Brazil is improving the process, so now you can start signing things electronically, so you don't have to go to the notary office anymore. So slowly the bureaucracy is reducing a bit in Brazil, and hopefully will continue to get better. But if you're someone that comes from a country where bureaucracy is pretty low, things are pretty quick and easy to do, then you might get a shock and a bit frustrated moving to Brazil. Okay, and another challenge living in Brazil is the infrastructure. So I'm talking schools, hospital, roads, And all of these things can be a bit lacking in certain parts of Brazil. So we've talked about the roads first. So yeah, there are roads like this. So I mean, this is the Trans-Amazonica in the Amazon rainforest. But I don't think all roads in Brazil are like this. I mean, you've got many good freeways in Brazil, especially in the southeast around Sao Paulo and the south as well. But many of these freeways have tolls, and so you have to pay to drive on them. Usually the fees are between 5 reais and 15 reais, so between $1 and $3. So they're not that high, but there can be quite a few, so it can add up, especially if you have to travel on those freeways constantly. And then the other roads, which aren't toll roads, so in the cities and in the countryside, they can have quite a few potholes and other problems. And so when you're driving, you have to be very careful and aware, so you don't drive into a massive pothole and damage your tires, which I've done quite a few times. And in terms of other infrastructure, like schools and hospitals, my experience in general is that in the big cities, they can be a bit lacking and not the best. But in the smaller towns and cities in the countryside, especially in the south of Brazil, there the local governments can be more organized. And as a result, the services like the hospitals and schools can be better. And I've lived in a few big cities in Brazil. And when I lived there, I had to pay for a lot of these services. So my daughter went to a private school rather than a public school, and I had health insurance, and we just went to private hospitals and clinics rather than the public ones, and also in terms of security as well. And so we and the neighbors paid for a security guard to be on our street to offer more security, because the neighborhood felt that the policing wasn't sufficient. And so what happens is that you end up having to pay for a lot of these services, which in Sweden and many European countries, you would just totally rely on the government to provide. But now, having left the big cities and living in a small town in the countryside here in the south of Brazil, things are very different. And as a result, you don't need to pay for these privately, and you can use the public ones. Okay, and another challenge of living in Brazil is the climate. So in summertime, it can get very hot here in Brazil. So this includes the north and the northeast of Brazil, central Brazil, and the south and the southeast. So temperatures can hit the high 30s, and you have to have the air conditioning on the whole time. And even during the nights, you can have to sleep with the air conditioning on. And this can be a real challenge. And also in some parts, especially the south, it can be very humid as well. So it's both hot and sticky. And I personally think that's even worse, because then you walk outside and within a few minutes, your clothes are all wet and sweaty and you feel horrible. And yeah, if I had to go to work every day in a suit, I think I'd go crazy with this heat. But if you're able to work from home and you don't have to commute every day in the heat, then it's not that bad, and I think it's pretty manageable. But then also, it's not the whole of Brazil that gets super hot. So you have some mountainous areas all around Brazil. So for example, around Sao Paulo, you have Campos do Jordão. And further south, you have towns like Urubici and São Joaquim and Santa Catarina as well. And then Gramado Canela in Rio Grande do Sul. And all of these towns are in the mountains. And as a result, the summers in these towns are a lot cooler, and you don't have these crazy temperatures. So it's possible to move to areas in Brazil which have much milder temperatures. But if you want to live in the big cities where the job opportunities are best and so on, then these cities are pretty hot. So Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Florianópolis, Porto Alegre and so on. And then you need to be prepared for the heat. Okay, and then finally another factor is the crime. So crime levels in Brazil can be pretty high, especially in the big cities. Fortaleza, Recife, Salvador, and also Rio de Janeiro. These have very high crime levels. But you have other cities further south, like Florianópolis, Curitiba. They have much lower crime levels. But then in the smaller towns and cities in the countryside in Brazil, these can be even safer. So the town that I'm living in, so here it's very safe. You can walk around with your mobile. You can walk around at nighttime. You won't have any problems. And you have lots of cameras, and the police are very active. And I feel very safe here. Now, that's not the case in all the smaller towns and cities in Brazil, but you have many that are super safe. Okay, so that was a list of challenges and difficulties of living here in Brazil. Now, like I said at the beginning, I think Brazil is great. And for me, the positives of living in Brazil definitely weigh out the negatives. But that doesn't mean that's the case for everyone. Then you just need to analyze and see if any of the things that I mentioned are deal breakers for you before you decide to move here. Please leave a like, subscribe. If you've got any comments, leave in the comment section below. So thanks for watching. Until next time.